Some of the things that work really well that I have seen is having these sort of innovation precincts where you might have, like an accelerated incubator within a hospital setting next door to a venture capital, next to a university. And you kind of like have everyone working together where you can get products out, test them quickly, you can bring them back, you can get really fast access to capital, you can work with the clinicians to get feedback, that you're embedded in the clinical governance and safety aspect of a health system, and you're much more likely to, I think, get a product that's going to be usable, that's going to be safe, and then you can get help to get through the regulatory process.
Hello and welcome to Clinical Changemakers. Today on the show we have Dr. Amandeep Hansra. She is a GP, founder, investor, director, and digital health consultant. Dr. Amandeep Hansra, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about your experience in the startup space as an entrepreneur, investing in healthcare innovations. But before we do, I'd love to learn a little bit about some of the transitions you've made in your career, particularly moving as a GP into some of these more corporate spaces. What are the kinds of things that you learned along the way that perhaps clinicians don't always know and could be helpful if they're going in that direction?
Look, I would like to say that I planned this all out when I first went to medical school, but I really just kind of ended up accidentally, I think, in digital health, which is probably what a lot of people say. I mean, I had a very normal sort of clinical path at the beginning of my journey and into general practice. Did general practice with those great foundation and basis to being able to go into any area after that, because we get a lot of subspecialization once people go into general practice. And so having that broad base knowledge and experience and skill set was sort of where I started. I just accidentally ended up working for a clinic that actually got bought by a corporate, and that corporate happened to have also a virtual care business or a virtual care arm of their business. And they just asked me one day if I wanted to go across and help them set up a part of their telehealth service, which was for GPs. And this is what I tell everybody, is you just kind of say yes to things, even if you're not quite sure what you're saying yes to, because the chances are it's going to open you up to an opportunity or an experience that you probably would have never chosen for yourself. And in that way, you get to learn, like, whether it's something that is for you or not for you. And I was very lucky in that me saying yes opened up a whole world of opportunity, because I got thrown into the whole virtual care space, learned a lot about telehealth, about how virtual care solutions can solve some of our challenges around access to care in this country. And particularly, we've got obviously a lot of people living in rural, regional and remote areas, and I could see how technology could play a role. And that's when I started to get interested in tech. And from there, really, the rest became history, because once you've got one role in the health tech space, and there were so few of us back then, it just made you attractive to other corporates. And then I ended up being recruited into Telstra Health, one of the large telcos here, ended up setting up telehealth service for Telstra and becoming their chief medical officer. So sort of transitioned from one corporate to another corporate. And alongside all of this, I continued clinical practice because I didn't want to lose my skills as a GP. And it just added so much more credibility to what I did in the technology space. But working at Telstra was an incredible experience. I got to work with a Swiss company, Medgate, learnt a lot about what was happening internationally in the virtual care space, all before COVID. And so when COVID came along, I was the right person to call for a lot of people. So I spent many an hour during COVID trying to help people upskill and learn how to do telehealth well. And then I think the whole digital health space just expanded. And again, I transitioned sort of from just being a telehealth person to being a broader digital health person, because I realized there was so many different components to the technology that we use to deliver care. And so I did everything from looking at EMR rollouts in hospitals to being involved in clinical innovation and apps and remote services that were provided by health insurers. I got involved in, data projects, clinical governance, and it just kept growing. And I think, as I mentioned to you before, Jono, it's like now got to a point where digital health is so broad and so big, like the options are almost endless of where you might want to double down.
And what I'm hearing from that is not only the kind of serendipity of these opportunities as they come, but actually just being out there, going, putting your hand up, as you say, picking up opportunities that might not be completely clear about where they're going to lead. But you don't necessarily need to do what a lot of doctors often think they need to do, which is study more, pick up more degrees, do all these sorts of things. Perhaps it's about gathering some experiences, building out maybe a portfolio of those types of experiences, and then pulling on those threads as they kind of come at you based on those experiences.
Yeah, and it's interesting. People always say to me, I think you got those opportunities because you were in the right place at the right time. But I actually had to be in a lot of places to be in the right place at the right time. And so part of it is putting yourself out there. And if you think about when people make decisions about who might be good for a particular project or who can they think of at the top of their head might be worth, tapping on the shoulder to come and do something, they'll think of the last few people that they met. They don't often go back, years and years. They've got people have short-term memories. And so just by purely the fact of being around, being at conferences, being part of these digital health communities, I happen to be quite sort of, I guess, a front of mind. People remember, oh yeah, I saw you just the other day, and I know that you're good at X, Y, Z, and then will remember you and ask you to do something very different to the traditional linear kind of medical path, because so many of the roles in the digital health space are about kind of like who you know, and they're kind of not always advertised. They're just people asking other people to come in and help with a project, because there's not a specific college that you would go to or a specific group of clinicians that you go, they're the experts in this area. You really just kind of have to seek them out. So I always give people advice around, getting yourself known, being in the right places, going to the events. And it's a bit of an uncomfortable feeling for some clinicians because networking isn't really like our strong suit. We don't get taught about it in medical school. We feel a bit salesy when we try and like market ourselves. But it's not even just about going and saying, look how brilliant I am. It's just turning up and saying, I'm interested. Like what can I get involved in?
And just asking questions, right? Exploring those interests, and finding some of those communities where some of those like-minded people are around. Now, you started up one of those communities. I wondered if you could talk to that experience and how it came about.
Yeah, look, I'm incredibly proud of the community. And it's not just myself, but, a group of great volunteers that have all helped me build that, selfishly was created for myself. So I always say to people, if you can't find the community that you want, build it. And that's pretty much what I did. I was like, where are all these other cool people? And people like yourself, people like, our mutual friend, Honor, like there was all these really interesting people that I met, but I knew we all had a common thread, a common interest, but we weren't all under the same umbrella. Like we didn't all belong to the same college, or we didn't all belong to the same peak body, or weren't in the same physical location. How do you connect those people that are thinking differently about the future of healthcare? And so for me, it was about challenging some of the status quo about what a medical career could look like, helping people be satisfied with what they're doing because they were given more options, allowing people to have flexibility and adaptability, being able to do things like portfolio careers, or being able to change up some of the clinical work they were doing, and really giving people an awareness of what was out there and what was possible, and having some leaders that had been there and done that before and pulling them together, begin the start of that community, was really what I set out to do initially. So it was literally just calling up my friends and saying, you're so cool, I love what you've done, let's just hang out and create this kind of group that everyone can belong to. And it just grew from there, and it grew and it grew, and now we have about 25,000 people in our community, and they are doctors from all walks of life, mostly Australian, New Zealand based, but now we've got followers all over the world. And we run a podcast, the Creative Careers in Medicine podcast, where we showcase some of these inspiring people who've had really diverse careers. Then we also do events. So we've got a conference coming up next year, the next one in August. We had one earlier this year. We hold webinars, so we try and support people with jobs and, helping them gain more skills in different parts of, I guess, the whole span of what their career could do, not just in clinical skills. And so, yeah, we've just been very excited to see it grow, and very excited to see some of the product of people belonging to the community, where they've now gone down whole diverse career paths that they've been made aware of through the community.
Such a fantastic story, and I'm loving to see how much it's growing, because I think as well, in particular, there is so much more of a spotlight on mental health for clinicians, and burnout is so topical. And I think being able to express your career dreams in other creative ways makes a career sustainable. It makes you get up in the morning and want to do the work. And the risk is we have people turning off medicine, leaving medical school, burning out early, and completely leaving the health and well-being kind of career space, and that's a huge problem.
And it's not just a problem in Australia. Recently, we were in the US at the health conference in Vegas, and the founder, Nisha, of Physician Side Gigs, so similar sort of group where they've got doctors doing different things. And she did a presentation, and there were some alarming statistics about the number of doctors that would not recommend medicine to their children. I can't remember the exact number. It was something like 70 or 80%. And there was huge numbers of people that were planning on leaving the system in the next sort of few years, and they weren't at retirement age. And it really made me think, obviously there's problems, that are unique and specific to, say, countries like the US, because they've got a huge admin burden and overheads, and the doctors are doing a lot of things they don't love doing. But it is a global problem, and I think it's part of it is the immense pressure that all the health systems are under. So we're now getting to a point where, great, we've managed to make people live longer, but as they live longer, they have more complex diseases. They, have increasing health knowledge, literacy. Their expectations have lifted in terms of what they expect from their healthcare professionals. We are expected to know more. We are flooded with information now, more information than ever before, and we have to make decisions. And on top of that, you throw in a global pandemic, and you've just kind of accelerated some of that burnout that was already coming, because now you put them under immense pressure and stress, and now you've got all this backlog of things that weren't done during COVID for patients. You add that on to our complex chronic disease and aging population, and you kind of have a perfect recipe for disaster, really, if you don't address the workforce issues. Because without the number of clinicians that we need, how are we going to deliver the services to the populations? And this is where technology comes in and has a really interesting role, because maybe we do need to find a way that the clinicians are doing the things that are at the top of their scope, and that they're not doing the things that can be done either automated or done by other members of the healthcare team. So it's always also looking at how do we build better healthcare teams. So I think there's a lot of change that needs to occur in most health systems across the world to try and protect this workforce that is going to be under increasing pressure over the next sort of few decades.
It's an and scenario, right? And the person at the center, the patient, and their family around them, often doing a lot of the health sort of activities before they even reach out to a healthcare professional. So what does it look like for technology to support and facilitate people in those moments before they've even connected with conventional doctors, nurses, and those kinds of groups?
There is also a push, and a good push, towards preventative care. And I think for a long time, whether it's governments or funders, have kind of looked at a very reactive model of medicine and healthcare. You get sick, we give you the medicine, we make you better. But they've now realized that if you don't invest upstream into preventing that episode ever happening, that's going to actually save you a lot of money. And there's plenty of data around investing into primary care and how much that saves for the whole system, rather than building more and more beds and more hospitals. But we do need to have a bit of a mindset shift, because the problem with investing in preventative care is that it's a long-term game. You don't see the returns necessarily until it's 10 years down the track, and often governments aren't in position, for more than a few years. So sometimes it's hard to see, well, if I'm going to do something now and I don't see the return for another 10 years, what's the point? But I think we're realizing that if we keep having that short-term mindset, we're just passing the problem on, and a bigger and bigger problem, to future generations. So for me, it's like, yes, we know, we've got the data, we understand that preventative care is the way to go. We now have technology and tools that could potentially be given to patients to start some of that preventative care journey themselves. And then how do we bring the clinicians in to be able to spend more time dealing on that side, rather than just being reactive to things down the track when it's already too late?
What are you seeing in the kind of startup and innovation space that's kind of capturing some of this type of thinking? Because I can imagine, just picking up on your comment before about the investment side of things, I imagine it's very hard to get investment into these products that the value is incremental and takes a long time to accrue.
One of the reasons I got involved in the startup space, I mean, I love working with founders. I feel like, for all of the depressing elements sometimes in medicine and healthcare, we just kind of talk about doom and gloom. You can offset that by hanging out with entrepreneurs who've just got eternal optimism about what they can do. And sometimes I want to ground them and say, you're probably not going to be able to solve diabetes in the next 5 years, but you also love the idea that they think they can, because you need that. And I think without that kind of optimism and positivity, you're not going to get these incredible entrepreneurs that are going to try and solve these big challenges in healthcare. But I also love the fact that a lot of founders will come from other industries and get really passionate about solving something in healthcare because they've had a personal experience or a lived experience. But what they do bring with them, they might lack the knowledge of health systems and the health experience themselves, but they bring the diversity of solving problems in other industries that we could probably learn and leverage. And so they bring that in, incredibly positive, incredibly optimistic, great to work with. The problem becomes is they can't find people to fund what they're building, because most investors who are sector agnostic, the venture capitalists who are looking at what's the quickest return, largest return we're going to get, they don't often look at health as a sector that is, a priority, because you can make a lot more money in other sectors because it's much easier to get products out into the market. You don't have regulatory barriers, you don't have funding barriers, you don't have systems where the government pays for part of the services and then there's insurers and then there's people paying out of pocket. Like, we've got a very complex kind of system for people to bring products and services into. So what happens is that the investors go for things that they understand and that are easy, and it leaves health tech entrepreneurs with a real kind of challenge around getting money in. So, often people would go to family and friends and they'd say, put a bit of money in so I can get a minimum viable product out. But what we've realized is that they need more than money. They need expertise. They need people who understand health system. They need channels into the market. And so part of what we did with Australian Medical Angels is created a group of angel investors who are doctors who can bring more than the money. So, many of them do have some money to bring. So outside of the friends, family, fool round, you have this great group of angels who will bring money, but they'll potentially also help market your product. They'll use it. They'll tell their peers about it. They might give you expertise, advice, and, potentially even join the team. And we've seen this real great ecosystem develop as we have started to invest in some of these health tech companies over the years. And the problem is that, yeah, we do have to be patient because they're not going to make money tomorrow. There's something that you've got to be in it for maybe a decade to get returns. But if you're invested in the space, you care about the space, you're less worried about that timeline.
Having those subject matter experts who are in the field, who understand the value add, that's a really powerful asset to have for a founder. I wonder, in medicine, we can be quite stuck on how we've done things in the past. And what I'm thinking about is evidence generation. And pharmaceuticals, we have very clear approaches to evaluating products to understand if they work. There's a second order question, which is then how is it used in the real world by clinicians that often perhaps we aren't as hold the same scrutiny on as we do to the research. How have you found these startups when they've gone to the medical angels and been able to articulate that evidence and that value proposition?
This is another challenge, and I think we've been very well trained to look at evidence and evidence in a certain way. So it's the randomized control trials. It's across lots of sites. It's across lots of time. We've got years that we're studying something. If it's a pharmaceutical, and then it goes through a process through like the Therapeutic Goods Association or the FDA or CE. So we've been used to that kind of process when we decide what we use or what we give our patients. It's very hard to replicate that in the world of technology. And it's really stumped, I think, a lot of the regulators over the years of how they regulate technology, because you can't go that traditional route where you expect them to do, multi-year randomized control trials, because the technology is evolving so fast. And even if you do, so for example, if you've got an AI product that goes through one of the regulatory bodies, and the day it goes through and they say this is safe to use, within a few minutes it's changed already, right? It's a dynamic product. So how do you continue to assess that product and say that's still safe for use? And I think a lot of the regulators have had to go back to very basic principles and say, well, we have to look at the processes that you're using, the principles, rather than the end product. So it's almost like going to the drug manufacturer going, well, we can't test the actual drug because it can change every day, but we're going to check, your manufacturing processes, and who do you use as your third parties, and etc. So I think that it's been a challenge, and that's why I don't think we're quite there in terms of being able to give clinicians the comfort that every technology that's out there is regulated as it's supposed to be. I think there's still things that are falling through the cracks that are not fitting into the umbrellas that the regulators are giving us to say these things need to be regulated and these ones don't because they don't pose any clinical risk. I think there's still clinical risk in some of those areas that the regulators aren't looking at, but we just don't know enough. So there's a lot of unintended consequences that can happen from using technology that we actually just are unaware of without having had them around for a long time. But I think there is a mindset shift for clinicians that needs to happen, where they need to look at technology in a different lens to how they look at normal sort of drug therapeutics or devices or other things that they use, because there is that constant evolving nature. It's moving so fast. You don't have time to do those kinds of trials. And we do have to look at a lot more real world evidence, that's in practice. But again, we do have services that are set up to do post-market surveillance for drugs. So we can continue to follow them after we've regulated them. That doesn't happen in technology yet, and I think that does need to happen, because how are we capturing the data of what is happening out there in the community? So in Australia, and I'm pretty sure it'd be the same in New Zealand and other countries, there are so many pilots of health services and healthcare professionals using AI in practice. And whether that's as AI scribes or as clinical decision support systems or for, AI call agents, whatever it might be across the system, they're using these tools. But there is no one body that has a full picture of everything that's being done across the country and can say, hey, something happened over there. We've got to make sure that the whole country knows about it so that we can all learn from each other. So I still think we're quite early in evolving our structures and our processes and our guardrails, guidance, regulation for the rapid development of technology. And AI is probably the one at the top of mind at the moment. Some of the stuff I look at and I go, oh my God, this is amazing. And some of the stuff I look at and go, that is really scary. And I'm not sure if I'm ready for this. So it's, I think we've still got a long way to go, but it's better for us to be in the tent as clinicians than to sit back and let other people decide how this is going to go down.
Any technologies that making clinicians' lives easier is going to be rapidly adopted by clinicians. That's not to say it's necessarily high quality or really rigorous or all of these other things. It's just the workload burden is at such a height that people are looking for any avenue. And that's where some of these AI scribes and other types of tools of that nature are going to start joining the workflow and become embedded. And what you're saying is at the moment we don't really have good enough infrastructure to be testing and monitoring and doing all of those things that would be perhaps a best practice. And so there's a risk that if we're not careful, some of these things will be causing some harms, and basically nobody will know. Another piece here around that regulatory space is interesting to think about, where some of that regulatory overhead could stifle innovation, because if you're asking people to create evidence before for the MVP product, which is just just trying to prove a concept out, you could be making it a high bar for people to join. What's your sort of take on how that sweet spot's found?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually been in some conversations in some of the communities that I've been in recently, where we're talking about, safety and quality and regulation. And at the same breath, trying to make sure that we are not stifling innovation, as you said, because if you think about a lot of the great software that's developed, the great tech that's coming through from startups, it's often founded by, I'm going to generalize here, a couple of young people who are, very tech literate, but the first instances don't have a lot of money. And you're suddenly asking them to go through these really arduous processes for regulation when they don't have funding, they're not even paying themselves, they're, running something, smell of an oily rag. And then you say to them, you suddenly have to spend all this money on building something that's going to then pass this regulation for you to be able to sell it. Yes, it would be a huge turnoff. And I have seen entrepreneurs that have deliberately modified their product to sit outside of regulation because they know that if they can sit outside, they can get to market faster, they can generate revenue, and then they can come back and do a circle back to the regulated product down the road. And one of the things that I've noticed people will do is they will build a product and use it in other industries. So, for example, in the sports space. So, worked with an AI company that is looking at gait analysis. And so they'll say, well, we can use this in sports and in healthcare, but healthcare is going to take us a lot longer. We have to be regulated. It's going to cost us money. It's going to cost us time. We need to get some money in the door. So let's sell it to the sports industry. The other place that I see people doing kind of like the roundabout way is going into the vet industry. So people will go and see if they can sell things because it's less regulated for animals and then come back around and do it for humans. Which, is really like an avenue that some of them have to take because they can't afford to go through regulation. And that's with the current regulatory environment. So if we did make it tougher, are we just going to discourage people from ever doing innovation for human healthcare, I guess is a challenge. So I think we do have to find that fine line of having enough opportunity for these guys to feel like they can innovate and they can sort of have a sandpit to play in, but at the same time make sure that no one's going to come to any harm if they're doing that. And I think some of the things that work really well that I have seen is having these sort of innovation precincts where you might have, like an accelerated incubator within a hospital setting next door to a venture capital, next to a university, and you kind of like have everyone working together where you can get products out, test them quickly, you can bring them back, you can get really fast access to capital, you can work with the clinicians to get feedback, that you're embedded in the clinical governance and safety aspect of a health system, and you're much more likely to, I think, get a product that's going to be usable, that's going to be safe, and then you can get help to get through the regulatory process. I think that's where we really need to go, is actually to have that co-location of innovation from all stakeholders sitting at the same sort of table, literally, but because it is such a complex process and an environment to innovate in.
And so, with all of your experiences in the startup world and now doing investing as well, what is it that you look for in a team or a product that kind of tells you that this thing looks like it could be going somewhere?
We don't really invest as much into products as we do as into people. It's the people behind the products that are going to make the product successful. And my view is that you can always change the product. So you can talk to people, you can iterate, you can, I hate the word pivot, but you can pivot, and you can change what you're delivering. And I've seen that happen. But the people that are involved are going to stay the same. So if you're investing in a couple of founders, they're the founders. They're not going to leave generally. So you have to have the right people, and the right people are people with the mindset that suits healthcare. And part of that is accepting that you don't know everything about everything and that you do need help. So the best founders that we work with in Medical Angels have been the ones that, say they're not clinicians themselves. They're very aware of having clinical input and engagement early. So they will already have a clinician as part of the founding team, or they will have an advisory board full of clinicians, or they will have started, having a clinical consultant come in. The people that make me nervous are someone who's not got any clinical people in their team at all. They've not consulted anyone, and they're like, we know how to do this better. So that scares me, because I'm not saying that we clinicians are, God, and we need to be involved to like make anything successful, but it's just a recognition and an acknowledgement of the risk that's involved if you don't have someone with deep subject matter expertise around the system. Because when things go wrong in healthcare, people die. Things go wrong in other industries, bad things happen, but people are still alive at the end of it. So I do like people who understand the risk and bring clinical expertise in early. I think also founders that are more mission led, that are not sort of looking at this is just a payday, because there are better ways to make money. I think it's people who really believe in the social impact element of innovating in healthcare, and they're really looking at, well, what can I do to change outcomes in the system, or help patients have a better experience. And it's not just, here, I can show you this hockey stick, representation of what's going to happen to my revenue, my profit. Like, that's great, but we actually care about what are you doing for the health system or for the patient. So those are the sorts of things I think I really look for in the founding team, and the product almost comes second.
I wanted to also pick up on a bit of the beginning of your story in the startup space. You made a comment that you were lucky enough to be part of a startup that sat inside a large corporate. How do you contrast that experience to the other startups that you've worked with outside of that?
I think that's where I first got the startup bug, was as like, when someone gives you a piece of paper and says, this is what you need to build, and away you go, and you literally have no one and nothing. And you're like, I've got to create something out of this. I love that stuff. So I'm a creator, I'm a builder. I've realized that at heart, that's what makes me happy, is the from nothing building something. And I got to do that. I think the difference was that I had a funder. So I didn't need to go out to raise capital. So I was given, here's a capital, you now need to build something. Obviously, that made life a lot easier because I wasn't concurrently building a product at the same time as trying to raise capital, because I think that's a really hard thing that founders have to do. But the downside for me was that risk was an issue. Like, I was attached to a large brand name that was well known in the Australian market, and I couldn't afford to do anything wrong. I couldn't afford to be experimenting. I couldn't take risks. When you're a sort of unknown startup, you can kind of have a little bit of a play because nobody knows you, and you can have a go and you don't lose everything. But if I stuffed up in that environment, I could bring the credibility of the whole brand down. And this is one of the largest companies in Australia. So everything that I did had to go through a lot of processes to get approved. And I don't like to use the word bureaucracy, but things did take a lot longer than you would have in an agile startup environment, where you would build something today and you could put it out to the market tomorrow. I'd have to go through multiple layers of approvals before I could put something out. And sometimes it got knocked back. And so that was hard and difficult. But in terms of all the other challenges of trying to come up with a business model, of having to go out and do BD, I remember the first year, I think I did like 300 sales meetings. As a doctor, had never done sales in my life. And suddenly I was like the salesperson. And so you kind of learn all these new skills, and you really learn the hustle and the whole roller coaster of people being really interested, and you think they're going to sign a contract, and then they pull out last minute, and your heart sinks and you think it's all over, but you've got to get up the next day and do it all over again. Like, that roller coaster ride, it can be both addictive and really exhausting at the same time. And so I kind of got all of those emotions and those feelings I think a lot of startup founders have. But I also had, the constraints around risk and brand and credibility with my parent company that I had to be mindful of.
I think that's a really interesting story because big corporates, governments, big organizations who already deliver a service or a product consistently to their customers or patients, they expect the same thing. There's a brand attached. You're fulfilling those needs of that legacy, and then trying to innovate, trying to do something different without, as you say, harming the brand or doing something, taking that risk can be a real challenge. When you reflect on that, do you see anything that maybe in the future, could have made some of that restriction a little bit lighter, or a model that you've seen perhaps that these big organizations could do or reshape this type of innovative startup within the big organization?
A lot of big corporates have tried to build kind of innovation arms or accelerators, or, tried lots of different models. Some of them have partnered with accelerator groups. Some of them have carved off a piece of their business that can be just involved in innovation and can move quite quickly and not have to go through the main part of the big organization, and kept it at an arm's length. I think a lot of people have tried this kind of, sort of internal innovation approaches. I don't know that anyone's like solved it, but I do think that you do need to create a structure that sits separate from your normal processes within a large corporate for BAU. Like, BAU needs to continue. You don't change that up because there are reasons, as you said, like you've been delivering services for customers for a long time and you've got processes in place for a reason, and you shouldn't change those. But those processes do not suit a startup agile environment. So you've got to replicate another environment where you do free up, the innovators and the entrepreneurs to be able to move fast, because they're a different type of personality as well. I've realized that when you think about entrepreneurs, they get really frustrated in large corporates because they want to go out and, be testing and building new things and, create new things. And if you try to put them in a normal BAU of a large corporate, they don't survive very well. So to track the right people, you also need to give them the right environment. And that is, I think, sitting at an arm's length. And that's whether you have a different brand, because branding is one thing. You don't want it associated with your brand in case something goes wrong and then you've tainted your whole big, huge, decade long that you've, built up. So I think having something that sits quite separate, that you can still own, it still belongs to you, but you let them do their own thing and you create an environment that allows innovation to flourish. And then when something really succeeds, you bring that into the large corporate and you get to use that. Because normally you could go out to the market and look for startups or innovations that you can bring into the corporate, but here you're able to build something that's very specifically going to address your needs as an organization. So you can kind of curate it, and then you're able to bring it in when it's ready and you've de-risked it because it's had some time sitting out there doing what it needs to do. So I do think it needs to be fairly separate. I'm not saying that corporates shouldn't have those types of arms of their business, but I do think it needs to be separated from the main business.
From there, you went on to do a startup in a more sort of conventional, out in the wild type of space. Tell me a little bit about how you went from the ideation to action type of phase of hey, actually, we're gonna go in and we're gonna do this.
Yeah, so this was a very similar service to the one that we're building at Telstra, but it was a telehealth business in the Philippines. And I guess the ideation part of it probably cheated a little bit because we already had a model of like, this is how you can do virtual care. But it was in a very different environment and context. And it wasn't with a large corporate, it was kind of like on its own with a couple of people building this thing. The thing that was interesting about it was that you could take the same business, right? The same model of care, the same product, the same service, you put it into a completely different health system and the outcome is incredibly different. So I remember when I was trying to run the business within Telstra, the challenge we had was we had no Medicare rebates, so no government rebates for the service we were delivering. So we had to find private industry that would pay, we had to be very creative about where we found an opportunity for revenue to come in, because it couldn't be funded the normal way health services are funded in Australia. This was back pre-COVID. But when we took the similar model into a new country where there was a system that did pay for telehealth, and it was the HMOs and the insurers. So the Philippines had a very similar health system to the US, where you had health system HMOs and insurers payers that would pay for primary care, which they didn't do in Australia. It meant that we had a whole new opportunity to build a business model around that. Even though you went from a very developed country like Australia to a more developing country, the opportunity for a successful outcome was much greater over there, which I was intrigued by, because I realized at the end of the day, it's not just about the product or the service that you're delivering or how you execute it. It's actually the environment that you're executing and the timing, right? So timing is everything. We know that from the pandemic, because so many companies did really well then or really badly, depending on what was happening. But I think what it made me realize was that you have to examine what is the environment that you're going into, what is the potential like funding opportunities for what you're building, and some of the cultural aspects as well. So, who would have thought, but the weather in the Philippines made a difference. So, when you had this tropical weather where you'd have massive, downpours and the traffic was atrocious. So it would take you 3 hours to get from one side of Manila to the other side, whereas normally it'd take you 10 minutes as soon as it rained and it flooded. But of course, then what do people do? They don't want to go out to visit the doctor. They want to go and do virtual care. So even just the weather changed, the ability for us to be able to market this service to people. And, we did a sort of similar thing. We were working in the Middle East as well. And the cultural opportunities that telehealth kind of solved as well was really interesting for me. We had, a lot of women that weren't allowed to go out and visit, say, a male doctor during the day on their own. But if you could bring telehealth into their homes and they didn't have to leave, and you could bring them a female doctor into the home through virtual care, you'd solve a lot of those challenges of those women being able to access care. And so you started to realize there were like cultural things that made a difference. There were weather things, there were health systems. And so it gave me this really kind of interesting, experience of understanding the broader factors that play into the success of building, a health technology company or service across the globe, really. But yeah, super interesting.
And one of the classic challenges that can keep founders up at night is making payroll. Where the things might get lumpy, as you said, people are about to sign and they don't. Do you have any reflections on that experience in terms of keeping the business sustainable and growing?
A lot of the founders, I think, underestimate the kind of financial aspects of running a business, and particularly the clinician founders. And this is part of why we also run Seeker Lab, which is an accelerator sort of program to help people develop some of the skills they need, particularly clinicians who don't necessarily understand all those sorts of things, whether it's, the financial side or marketing or business models, etc. But yeah, it is something that keeps you awake at night when you don't see money coming in and you just see it going out. And then you worry about, are you going to be able to pay people? Do you have enough? I mean, I was lucky in some situations with the first business because I kind of had, I guess, this insurance policy that I had this large corporate behind me. If things got really bad, I could go to them and say, please give me more money. But, that wasn't going to go down well. And it did get to a point where I had to do a restructure and I had to let people go. And I've watched it with a lot of my startup companies that I've worked with over the years, and watching many of them, particularly over the last few years when we've had a reset of the market where people have really felt the pinch and they've had to downsize. And it's been gut wrenching to watch people that you've helped build a company get to the point where they have to let really good people go because they just know that they can't, give them the security that they need. And then you worry about, this job was helping, you know, feed their kids. And there's a real human aspect to that of you feeling that weight of responsibility of having all these people that you've hired. But so many of the companies, and even when we did it, with our business, you learn that, with some of those sacrifices, new opportunities arise. So you can then become really refocused on what do you need to build, what's rather than sometimes what happens, and I've done this with both of the businesses and I've seen other people do it as well, is that you start to spread yourself very thin. You start to work on lots of different things because people come to you with different ideas. You get customers asking for different things. And before you know it, you've built this massive thing, but it's not scalable. You're not hyper-focused. You're a bit scattered about what you're offering. And what happens is when you have to let people go and you have to really think about dollars, is you become hyper-focused on this is what we're really good at. This is our product. This is what we're going to stick to. And this is how we're going to scale it. And I've seen people go backwards to then go leaps forward in terms of getting it right. And sometimes that reset is actually exactly what your business needs. So I think, people shouldn't be afraid of bringing things back in when they need to, when they are worried about money, when they're worried about having too many staff to pay, and things aren't just materializing as they expected, from whether it's contracts that didn't get signed or revenue that didn't come in or business models that don't work. You've got to go back to the drawing table and really think about what are you spending on and how do you get rid of that burn.
I guess to round out a bit of that story, what was your experience of the exit out of that business? What did you learn? What do you think founders should kind of know when they're experiencing that chapter in a company?
None of my exits were sort of traditional. Originally, we were kind of partly owned by Telstra and partly owned by this Swiss company, and then Telstra bought back the whole company and brought it internally, and we had a restructure. So that wasn't kind of like a traditional exit, but the company did go on and deliver different types of services, and I took that as an opportunity to go and do other things. And the second exit was a little bit non-traditional as well, because we ended up selling a large part of the business back to the Swiss company that had been involved in the other business as well, and they were looking at expanding that more across different parts of Asia. And the exits that I have sort of been through, seen, and kind of have been involved in across the board have all been very different, very unique in their own way. And I think what that shows is that the health tech space does not have like a well-trodden pathway to exit. So if you look at the pharmaceutical sector, it's like when someone like Brandon Capital in Australia invests in a pharma company, a pharma startup, they already know who's potentially going to buy it. They know who the exit partner is going to be, and they've lined that up from the beginning. And they might still be in that business for the next 5 years, 10 years, however long, but they know who's going to buy it. It doesn't work that way in health tech, because I don't think we've been around long enough to have these really well-trodden paths of potential exit partners for us in health tech. I think what we're also seeing is a changing landscape of who's interested in this space. So one of the interesting emerging types of exit partners in Australia is kind of like the large corporates. So we have like Wesfarmers, which is a large retail company here in Australia that has, gone into healthcare, traditionally been in sort of supermarket space and hardware and things, and they've now gone into buying healthcare companies, and they bought a telehealth script business, and they've also got pharmacies. And so you're starting to see these non-traditional organizations coming into healthcare. So they are exit opportunities that weren't there before. You haven't seen a lot of health tech companies go and be listed. So IPOs haven't traditionally been a thing. We have seen some large pharmaceutical companies also get into health tech and buy. Like we've had Pfizer do health tech acquisitions. We've had some consolidations of the market. People come together. I think a lot of health tech companies haven't been large enough to interest private equity unless they're looking at being an adjunct to a bunch of other things that they might be buying, because they still tend to be on the smaller side from like a revenue and profit sort of perspective as compared to sort of bricks and mortar businesses in healthcare. So we're starting to see that, I guess, we don't have the traditional tick list of who's going to buy this at the end. And people have to be open-minded and creative about who comes to the table. And it may be someone that you never imagined, but I say to people, like, entertain every idea, because you just never know where it might go. Because sometimes people say to me, so and so has approached me and they've talked about buying my business, and I'm like, and they're like, that's a really weird kind of company to want to own me. And I'm like, just go and have the conversation, because you just don't know what they're thinking. And some of those have turned out very successful and people have been bought. But I think it's about the fact that we're still very immature, because, if you think these companies have to be around almost 10 years before they get to exit, we've only really ramped up the health tech space, I think, in the last 5, to be honest. And so I think we're still going to have to wait a little bit to see where it settles in terms of who are those types of buyers in the market. They will be there, but they're just not nicely grouped like they are in other types of businesses.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your stories around building community as well as your own career experiences in the startup space. Dr. Hansra, I just really want to say thank you for all of your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it too.
And that brings us to the end of the podcast. If you want to go deeper about any of these topics or join in on the discussion, visit our website, clinicalchangemakers.com, or our YouTube channel. Finally, if you enjoyed our work, please give us a rating and share your favourite episode with a friend or colleague. Until next time, take care.